he had the longest name in the English language because there was miles between his first name and surname. Justin Miles Jones, Yonah Michael Ben Shmuel Zanvil, who left us yesterday, lived an interesting, unconventional and complex 89 years, and I have been asked on behalf of the family to say a little about him today. Perhaps his middle name is a good starting point. The name Miles was chosen by his mother Constance, who we knew as Nana, in honour of her uncle Miles Evergood, the internationally renowned artist who was born Maya Blaschke. Miles was a rebel, a free spirit, and very much an individual. Justin was born in Melbourne, where so many of his mother's extensive Blaschke family lived and live today. The Jewish family, with roots in what is now Poland, had arrived in Australia from Manchester, England in 1858, and by the late 19th century were well known and well respected in Melbourne and the Australian Jewish community. In this cemetery, we enter the Jewish section through Blaschke Avenue, named for another of my father's relatives. Constance and her sisters had featured in Melbourne newspaper social pages, with a 20th birthday party seemingly involving well-dressed flappers in a ping pong tournament. It should be mentioned that Justin was a deadly table tennis player well into his 40s. His father, Selwyn Jones, was born in Gateshead, Northern England, and also had the name Shmuel Goodentug. The Goodentug family were at the heart of the famous Gateshead Yeshiva. Selwyn Jones had storied early years, travelling far from the yeshiva life while retaining a strong Jewish faith and commitment to Jewish tradition. When Justin was a young child, the family left Australia for England, where Justin, his younger brother Brian of blessed memory, and little sister Janice, born in England, found themselves far from the security of Australia and in the direct line of German air raids in World War II. The author Alan Gill records that Constance and her children, with other family groups, had secured passage across the Atlantic to the safety of the USA. But the night before the voyage, Constance had a dream that the ship would be sunk by German torpedoes, and, when the time came, refused to board. The ship was indeed sunk, with many casualties, while the Jones family remained in England. At one stage, Justin was evacuated with other Jewish boys his age to Wales, to a Jewish school and orphanage. He loved the teachers there who encouraged two passions, Jewish learning and singing. He also claimed that he found himself in a place in which Jones was such a common name that the butcher was Jones the meat, the milkman was Jones the milk, the baker was Jones the bread, and he was proudly Jones the Jew. He was back in London for his bar mitzvah, but it did not go as planned. Justin told his descendants often that when the teacher, bar mitzvah boy, and the small congregation arrived for Saturday morning prayers, in which he was to read from the Torah, they arrived to find the building had been severely damaged in an overnight air raid. So the service took place in the open air, and the boy became a man, followed by a kiddush of herring and wine. Blessed with a gift particularly for English, he did well at school and enrolled at the London School of Economics. But hard financial times had fallen on the family, and Justin found himself working long hours to contribute to help support his family, with his brother and sister at different times telling me of the way in which he became both an economic and emotional support during difficult times. While not able to complete his degree, he took advantage of the opportunity while in England to meet and be inspired by Jewish teachers, who encouraged him to take up both teaching of children and chazanut, and we, his family, constantly meet people who say they were deeply affected by one or both of these talents of his. When he returned to Australia, he showed a motivation to make his family proud of him. He took to teaching, particularly of talented, high-achieving students, including Rabbi Raymond Apple, with gusto. He led synagogue services in Victoria and Tasmania. He won medals debating at Maccabi Carnival, worked hard in his chosen occupation, public relations, modelled his looks and mannerisms on his screen hero, Danny Kaye, and met and married a recent immigrant from England, Geraldine Kiverstein. In the first 6 years of marriage, he fathered 4 children, while his financial fortunes rose and fell, before taking a job in Adelaide for a few short years. In that time, he not only excelled in his profession, but became a central figure in Jewish education in South Australia. Visiting that city decades later, I repeatedly heard about the impact he made. He moved to Sydney for his career and for the larger Jewish community, living first in Strathfield, then Wollstonecraft, then Chatswood. He spent time running religious services and education at Bankstown and Strathfield synagogues while working to establish his advertising and sales skills. When he was given the opportunity to produce a then highlight of the Sydney Jewish calendar, the Great Synagogue Review, he found roles for all 4 young children, while his heavily pregnant wife assisted from the wings. He later moved to Killara, then 2 locations in Linfield, before crossing the bridge to a series of eastern suburbs homes, lived briefly in the Gold Coast before ending his days in Hunters Hill. When he was based in the centre of Sydney, he befriended an Italian tailor, John Serafino, who made sure that Justin was dressed in the highest quality suits, not just making an impression, but being a great advertisement for John's fashion business. In advertising, he met television royalty, such as Kamal, and claimed to have given Barry Crocker his first paid advertising work well before we had heard of Basil McKenzie. He also established a profile of his own, as he was able to articulate more words per 30-second television and radio advertisements than nearly anybody else. He was perhaps best known, however, for telling Sydney-siders to buy furniture from Macy's. While in Chatswood, the 5th child, Quentin, was born, and Justin became very actively involved in the Jewish community, becoming Vice President of the Jewish Board of Deputies. He became very involved in work with youth, both at the synagogue and community level, as well as in public relations work, mainly drafting letters to editors and politicians, which can still serve as templates for rational yet persuasive communication. He also regularly spoke to a variety of organisations of issues of concern to the Jewish community, and one night returned home very excited, having addressed the Australia Party with such success they asked him to consider standing for them for a Senate seat. Unfortunately, his family all told him that our political allegiances lay elsewhere, then and there ending a political career before it started. His other indulgences were the weekly rounds of golf, the twice-weekly chess tournaments, watching Match of the Day with 2 of his children who liked soccer, listening to The Goon Show, seeing his children progress through school, and Wednesday night poker. The success of the poker games might include that 2 of his sons-in-law were sons of his playing partners. He also listened and watched daily news avidly. It was an expectation that all family members would be aware of and able to discuss whatever stories were in the newspapers, on the radio and television in any given day. Even the notorious tabloids of the time were in our living room, as he often advertised furniture in their pages. This led to some difficult questions from his children, such as how Sydney had so many vice kings when we only had 1 queen, or why so many public figures became tired and emotional after alcoholic binges. He enjoyed having 3 teenage daughters at once and developed unique bonds with each of them. He liked travelling with the family when he could, with adventures in the USA, Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands. In those times in life in which business went well, his greatest pleasure was being able to contribute to charity, and his happiest moments were when given in honours in synagogue, such as reading Yonah in the synagogue on Yom Kippur. He took enormous pride in the fact that Australia's premier public affairs show, Four Corners, asked him to host a model Seder for filming and broadcast, and he was always happy when the episode was broadcast or file footage of our pre-Pesach home Seder appeared on screen. When told by my mother he should spend more time with me, he invited me to caddy for his weekend golf games. While the adults spoke with each other, I wheeled the bag, perhaps explaining my liking for walking and lack of interest in golf. He also discovered that one of his chess club colleagues ran a table tennis centre, and for a few months the poor club professional was forced to try to teach me to play the game so that my father could match wits over a chessboard with the owner. One item of family folklore concerns the firstborn, Peter, being old enough to learn to drive. The rest of the family will line up watching with anticipation as the car sped in reverse down a steep winding driveway, shot across the fortunately quiet street, coming to rest millimetres from the far curb. We saw the driver, Peter and the passenger, my father, change seats, and the car be driven very slowly back up the driveway. My father, white as a ghost, walked into the living room, poured himself a stiff, rather large scotch, then quietly informed us that a professional driving teacher would be required. That was the one and only driving lesson my father gave any of his 5 children. He tried his hand with varying success at a range of businesses, with his strength being convincing sales pitches. To a large extent, much depended on a quick mind and understanding of potential customers. With all children advancing their studies and careers, 4 of them married and the first grandchildren having been already born, he travelled with Geraldine on a European holiday when tragedy struck. Hit by a car while enjoying the positive vibes of Barcelona, he found himself in hospital with serious head injuries. After a number of weeks in hospital, he was able to be flown back to Australia, but never recovered faculties essential for his working life and for the range of human relationships. The last third of his life, he was still able to indulge passions for quirky items of general knowledge, to take pride in his grandchildren and sometimes even in their parents, lead synagogue services, play cards, enjoy movies with Joan, and for a period enjoy lawn bowls. But he was not able to return to working life or to have what might be thought of as natural emotions. In the years after his life with Geraldine ended, he met and married Joan, who provided him with companionship and a focus for affection until his passing. When they lived in the Gold Coast, Justin conducted synagogue services, giving him a record of leading prayer and worship in 5 of the 6 states in the Australian Commonwealth. His final years were spent in Montefiore in Hunters Hill, where he involved himself in religious and cultural life. He would assist his friend Rabbi Rogat whenever he could, particularly on the High Holy Days. He enjoyed the years when he ran communal seders with songs and storytelling. Visiting Montefiore one year, I was told by another resident who unfortunately had diminished mental capacity at the time that my father had gone mad. He thinks he is a slave in Egypt, testifying to what a good job he must have done in explaining the time of slavery and the Exodus. He ran a regular trivia quiz which helped fill the time of a dedicated group of home residents. He always was attracted to quirky information and to learning more details about subjects which appealed to him. When we spoke in recent months, he would always test me with questions he thought I should be able to answer, which I really could, and asked me to give him a few more questions. He liked it when answers to the questions I asked him involved his favourite chazans, such as Jan Pearce and Richard Tucker, or Monty Python, the Goons, or other absurdist British humour, or eccentric behaviour by the monarchy, or other tall topics. He was very fond of his grandchildren and later great-grandchildren. He enjoyed speaking with them and hearing news about them as they spread around the globe. His grandson Adir wrote, "So many memories from a childhood that we shared as Saba's grandchildren. Things that will ever remind me of Saba are lines that, don't drink water, it's for washing. Golf, fancy cars, speed walking ahead of the whole family back from shore, ferry rides, Sunday barbecues, story of life during the war as a child, and that he loved a good joke. Very rarely would a good time with Saba go without a good feed and some cold lemonade. We are a very special family and have so much to be proud of, and none of it would be without Saba. One thing is for sure, he was very proud of every single one of us." Granddaughter Rebecca noted, "I adored Saba and will miss him terribly. He was a complicated man, but there's no doubt he helped shape me. He was undeniably proud of us all." His granddaughter Danielle said, "He was a complicated man, a real character. He lived through so much, but had a love for learning that he passed on to all of his grandchildren. He challenged me with trivia questions, told stories, sang songs. It took him time to grow into being a grandfather. I think we all arrived too early, but he grew into the role. He will be greatly missed." We grew up in a house full of music, not just his favourite tenors, great opera singers, symphonies and chamber music, but the supergroup Cream, Deep Purple, Vanilla Fudge and Moody Blues. We grew up in a home which was the centre of Jewish youth activity in our area, where anyone hungry on Shabbat could come to eat. We grew up with literature, humour, a love of the English language and a keen intellectual interest in Jewish texts. We grew up with a father who, to me, always seemed a little in awe of where life had taken him, whether that meant a period of economic fortune or difficulty in supporting the needs of a growing family, whether it was the amazing people his children found as life partners, or the blessing he appreciated most, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He relished being a patriarch of sorts at the Blaschke family celebration of 150 years in Australia back in 2008, and having a connection to the scholars and teachers on his Guten Tag side. During the past 18 hours or so, I have heard many more stories from or about those who grew up with him as family or friends, those who he influenced as a teacher or he helped inspire spiritually through his chazanut, of men who remember being terrified of my father when they were dating his daughters, of people who remember his leadership in advocacy for the Jewish community and his contributions to Montefiore life. He will be great news.